The subject of this session was supposed to be, are Israel and Iran on the brink of confrontation? I think the subject is irrelevant, at least at the moment, because we are in the midst of a confrontation, both kinetic confrontation, a violent confrontation, and a confrontation with other means, including public diplomacy and media confrontation. And I have prepared opening remarks that are highly intelligent and wise, but I will skip since we have very little time. We have only 50 minutes, and we have 5 distinguished and very knowledgeable guests, and I would like to hear what they have to say, and not a rehash of what was heard in the last days. So we have here today, on my far end, Mr. Amos Gilead, Major General Amos Gilead, Reserve Amos Gilead, Executive Director, Institute for Policy and Strategy, IDC Herzliya, and also Assistant for Policy and Political Military Affairs to the Defense Minister for 13 years, right? Next to him sits Mr. Elliott Abrams, Senior Fellow for Middle East Studies, Council for Foreign Relations, former Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor to the President George W. Bush. In the center, and rightly so, sits Miss Sima, Senior Research Fellow, Institute for National Security Study, INSS, former Deputy Director General of the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, and other duties which she fulfilled in the Israeli intelligence community, etc., etc. Next is my colleague, right? Yes. Mr. Dr. Gary Samore, Executive Director for Research, Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, former White House Coordinator for Arms Control and Weapons of Mass Destruction, and a really distinguished research journalist, whom I know very well. And last but not least is Mr. John Raine, Senior Consultant Fellow, International Institute for Strategic Studies, and a record that if I will have to read it to you, first, not all of it I can read, and if I will read it to you, it will take a long time. So let's get to business. And let me ask you, lady and gentlemen, my first question is, in light of last night events, Trump's withdrawal from the nuclear deal with Iran, and the ongoing confrontation between the Iranian IRG, that is Qasem Soleimani, and Israel trying to take revenge from Israel on Israeli soil by shelling a target, military target on Israeli soil. In light of these events, do you think that it is possible, still possible, to stop the confrontation in the Syrian front? And my second question is, everybody says that all the sides involved, all the parties involved, are not interested in a war or in a confrontation. Is it really so? Is it in the interest of all parties to stop it now, or at least to mollify the confrontation now? Please, Mr. Raine, let's start with you.
Thank you. Is that working? Thank you. And on your point, whether or not both parties want to end this, I have no doubt that both parties, talking about Iran and Israel, would very much like to avoid an apocalyptic escalation of the current conflict. In some ways, the current conflict, by current we mean, what, the last 40 years, is something that both parties have become accustomed to. It's a question of what the next phase of that conflict looks like, and whether or not there's a mechanism available for containing escalation, and not just in style, but also in tempo, without there being some kind of stabilization of the situation in Syria. And I think the real difficulty is that the Iranian levels of aggression and their ability to attack Israel are directly a function of the continuing deterioration in the situation in Syria. Now, personally, I think it'd be enormously ambitious to go for any kind of grand regional settlement. History suggests that when you do that, you pay a high price, if not immediately, then over the course of the years. But I think absent some kind of containment of the situation in Syria, it's very, very hard to see how we're going to be able to reduce the ability of the Iranians to project threat towards Israel.
And what about the Russians and the Americans?
I'll leave others to talk about the Americans. I think on the Russians, the interesting thing is the speed and success with which the Russians have, first of all, projected power into the region, and when they do that, they tend not to withdraw it. So I think they're there as a permanent power broker and feature of the new Middle East. And secondly, is their ability to construct extremely pragmatic relationships, and I would put their relationship with Iran in that bracket, which means that they move diplomatically very quickly and very effectively. What we haven't yet done is get the Russians into a position where the power that they have in the region is matched by the responsibility that they're showing towards bringing about that greater stability.
Dr. Sima?
So I think that Israel and Iran have fundamentally different national interests in Syria. Iran wants to develop the capacity to strike Israel directly from Syrian territory, largely to deter Israel from launching an attack on Iran's nuclear facilities. And that Iranian concern is probably more acute now with the imminent collapse of the nuclear deal. Israel, understandably, wants to protect itself from Iran having that capability to attack it directly, given the fact that Israel's already vulnerable in the northern front from Hezbollah. So I think fighting will continue. There will continue to be Israeli attacks on targets inside Syria, and Israel has military dominance and a free hand to carry out those kinds of attacks. According to press reports, the Iranians are already planning to retaliate against Israel, and I expect sooner or later there will be an attack against Israeli military sites in the north, probably through proxies like the Shia militia that are operating in Syria, and Israel will retaliate. So there's going to be a back and forth continued fighting. But I think there are constraints on both Damascus and Jerusalem from escalating into a larger conflict. Neither Israel nor Hezbollah is very anxious to repeat the 2006 war in the north, so there's some constraint. And the Russians are also want to keep things under control, because their primary objective is to save Assad and consolidate his position. And a big war between Israel and Iran on Syrian territory will make that more difficult. The U.S. is largely irrelevant beyond the fact that we're helping to provide weapons to Israel. The U.S. has very little direct influence over the future shape of Syria. So my prediction is continued fighting, back and forth attacks, but not a full-scale conflict.
A question. Do you think, in your opinion, that the constructive ambiguity that Israel keeps as far as its military actions are concerned should be kept by Israel. Is it constructive, or is this ambiguity irrelevant anymore?
I mean, the theory is that by not publicly embarrassing the Syrians and the Iranians, you make it easier for them not to retaliate. I don't think that's very effective, because the Iranians know they're being killed by Israeli attacks. And that's why the Quds Force has apparently gotten approval from Supreme Leader to prepare some kind of retaliatory attack. So I'm not sure it makes much of a difference, frankly. And anyway, everybody knows that Israel is carrying out these attacks, whether the government
Thank you very much,
acknowledges it or
Dr.
not.
Samore. Ms. Sima Shine, your opinion, please.
I'll say three short remarks, since I agree completely with what was said before. One, I think we are on a collision path, us and the Iranians in Syria. Two, I think there is no military solution to the interest of both sides. The Iranians want to stay in Syria. We are determined not to allow them to stay there. If both sides continue to adhere to their positions, there will be several rounds of conflict of this kind or another. But I personally believe that there is no military solution to the issue of Iranian presence in Syria. Third point is the question of what will come at the end of that. And I believe that is, as in all wars, if it's a war or a collision or conflicts, temporary conflicts, the solution should be a political one. And therefore, I'm looking for to hear what happens with the Prime Minister's visit today in Moscow. I hope that it will be different from the previous 6, 7, 8 visits that were in Moscow that didn't come up with any real solution to the problem. And I agree with Gary, the Americans are not here, so we don't have the exit solution with an American mediation, which is unfortunate for Israel, I think. But I do hope that the Russians, being involved in Syria and having a vested interest in what happens in this region, will be part of a kind of a solution. And here I want to say one word about a political solution. Since I believe we cannot make sure that there is no one Iranian state in Syria, I think we should look on 3 dimensions of a solution. One is geographic, how far from our border they would be. 2 is qualitative, no missiles, no UAV, and other this kind of arms. And third is quantitative, which means how many Iranians and their proxies, Shia militias, Hezbollah, will stay in the long run in Iran. Gradually, they have to reduce their numbers.
In Syria, you mean?
Yeah, in Syria, of course. And gradually, they have to reduce the numbers, and I think this might be a kind of a deal.
And what if the Russians don't step in? And what if the Russians will turn against us? Do you think it's possible?
First of all, I think the Russians want to be a mediator, and I think it's important for them not only because they don't want a conflict with Israel. They had it, in the past, and they don't want to see any direct conflict between Israel and Russian forces. I think the open relation between Israel and Russia, we don't have the same interest, but we do have open relations and very frequent consultations. The question that I have not a very good answer that is whether the Russians have enough influence on Iran to make sure that any kind of a solution that will be arranged between Israel and Russia and Iran, they can enforce it on Iran. I think there is a question because there is a dependence of Russian dependence on Iran on the ground in Syria. They cannot replace them.
Are they still dependent on Iran?
They are still dependent.
On Iran, boots on the ground?
No question. They are very dependent. Of course, when you look on the whole relations between Russia and Iran, Iran is much more dependent on Russia than on the contrary, Russia on Iran. But when it comes to Syria, Russia is dependent on Iran very much, and therefore they have to take into account their interests. So the picture is mixed, and the flexibility of Russia to come up with a real solution is questioned.
Mr. Abrams, what is your evaluation of the current situation? How do you see it?
Thank you. I agree with the idea that ultimately there should be a political solution, but diplomatic solutions must always reflect, the actual balance of power on the ground. The fallacy that John Kerry, for example, pursued in Geneva with respect to Syria was the thought that you would create a balance of power in a diplomatic negotiation. That's not going to happen. So the question is, what is the balance of power, and how does the balance of power in Syria relate to the larger balance of power in the Middle East? For the last, more or less the last decade, Iran's power has been expanding. Who has been resisting? Well, certainly not the United States. In the last couple of years in particular, Israel and the Saudis and Emiratis in Yemen. Now the United States has, in a sense, joined the battle. Certainly rhetorically, it has joined the battle against Iran, but it has also joined it economically, which I think is quite important. So to me, one of the key questions here is whether we're now going to see an American policy that is coherent and whose purpose is really to push back against Iran in every way, in Yemen, in Syria, in Lebanon, economically, ideologically. Is there a new American policy that says, okay, enough? Iran will not dominate the Middle East. Now, I don't think that, I guess I agree that Russian and Iranian interests are not the same. Particularly in Syria, they're not the same. I could easily see a settlement in Syria that does not include Assad, that the Russians would easily agree with. I think that Assad is critical for Iran and Hezbollah. I don't think Assad is critical for the Russians. So I think it should be possible at some point to separate their interests somewhat and to look for some kind of agreement that that does not include Assad and that really diminishes Iranian power. But we're not going to get that through a negotiation. We're going to get that through a real-world pushback against Iranian power.
Do you think that Israel should get rid of Assad or keep him or preserve him?
Well, I think it is against Israel's interest for Assad to be in power in Damascus because he is not actually in power. He is now a puppet of Iran and Hezbollah. Whether it is wise right now to remove Assad from power is, I think, a difficult question, and I've not thought through what happens if Israel does that. But I do think that, in a way, having Assad in power is an asset for Israel in that you always can threaten to take him out. I think if I were the Iranians, one of the things that I would worry about in attacking Israel from Syria is that the Israeli response will be basically to bring down the Assad regime. And that is quite a blow against Iran's interests.
Thank you. Mr. Gilead, what is your evaluation of the situation?
It's complicated. Yes. I would like to share with you, I think with Iran the conflict is a strategic one for decades, and Syria is new phase. They want to build second Hezbollah. They are determined to do it, and we are determined to prevent it. It means we are on collision course. I cannot imagine something will change the strategy of Iran because United States is not in the game. What the United States is doing is dealing only with IS in Syria. It means they are helping Iran indirectly to build their presence. That's the strategic game. The Russians are entering the
They
vacuum.
ignore the fact that the Americans with their Kurds allies in northeast Iran are blocking the corridor,
You
the
mean Syria
Shiite
in
corridor.
Tanaf? Yes. They are blocking the corridor, but if you are relying only on corridor, There are windows for any house. There are doors. I trust the Iranians, they will know how to bypass. Because if United States, this is the leader of the free world, if they say, we don't want to be in Syria, it means others will come. Who are the others? Russia and Iran. The Russians do have deep sympathy with Israel, especially with the Russian Jews. They are not considering Israel a strategic ally. That's illusion. They are considering Iran a strategic ally. And I do think that Bashar Assad is an asset to them, because the power of Assad, that was born, by the way, on 9/11, he was born as terrorist. The power of Bashar, that he gives the licenses to legitimate presence. He gave it to Iran, he gave 2 bases to Russia. Why is the need to give him up? They will protect him, both of them. Now, to the point, I do think the Iranians are determined to build new Hezbollah with rockets, with missiles, in the depths of Syria. That's a strategic plan combined with Hezbollah, and after 8 years, they will not withdraw from the agreement to build the nuclear or to keep the option. Now, it means that we are on collision course.
You mean we,
Israel and Iran,
yes,
because we are alone in this front against all the support we do have. On the other hand, the
but
good
the
news...
collision has already started. Amos, what will be
It has
the
started long-
outcome of this collision?
Yeah, but we are affected only by the last event. This conflict continues for a long time. The good
On
news
the
is...
same level of intensity?
You know, it changes all the time. The good news, I think, the Iranians are not interested in war or wide confrontation, because that's not the timing for them. They need more power, the second front, the missiles, maybe economic support. They need to build the power. We are deterring them not to use the power, but we will not be able to deter them not to build the power. So wide war, I don't see it now. That's the good news. The bad news, we are on collision course with Iran for the next coming years.
Kinetic collision. Kinetic
And in other ways.
in other ways. Okay, let me ask you all a specific question. How do you think the withdrawal by the U.S. of the nuclear agreement, of the JCPOA, will affect the region and the conflict in Syria? Mr. Raine, please.
Well, we're all still coming to terms with the decision, but a few thoughts on that. First, picking up on what Amos has said, the Iranians have prosecuted over the course of the last 10 to 15 years an enormously successful policy of what they would call forward defense, which has relied increasingly on non-conventional means of force projection. And I'd go so far as to say that the Iranians have been preeminent in this as a means of extending their reach throughout the region. Now, in part, this has been because spaces have opened up, which they have exploited. Also, in part, spaces have been evacuated by other powers. But fundamentally, they've done it because they have taken, if I may say, a typically Iranian systematic approach to developing that capability. Forward defense, as they see it, relies upon the co-option of proxies of an increasingly varying typology. Not all of these are established parties. Some of them are relatively ephemeral groups, but the ability of the Iranians to identify them and co-opt them to their effort, to equip them and to deploy them against a strategic aim, is a sovereign capability which the Iranians have developed. And it is that capability which we have to push back on, to pick up on what Elliott was saying, as much as on their ability to develop ballistic missiles or conventional weapons. It is a distinct military, weaponized national capability. Now, on that, I think that you have to think in terms of the international community or the coalition of the willing, whoever it may be, developing a policy of forward containment, where we simply deny the Iranians the opportunity to develop these outposts, what are effectively very powerful forward operating bases for them. That takes us into a series of decisions which will be uncomfortable, because countering both those forward presences and the fantastic ability the Iranians have developed to project in the grey space, through not just cyber, but informational war, their ability to suborn and persuade, sometimes with coercion, people to their purposes, all of that needs to be pushed back in a systematic way. So just coming quickly on to where JPOA fits into all of this, if the Iranians feel isolated or threatened, we can expect them to capitalize upon their sovereign elements, the weapons in which they feel most comfortable. And one of those will most definitely be this ability to project forward through proxies. The second will be the deep reassurance they get from maintaining a sovereign nuclear capability. And I think it's regrettable, but already we've seen the Iranians recommitting to developing that capability.
Do you think they will renew their program officially of enriching uranium, for instance, or producing weapon-grade plutonium?
I think they will be cautious about this because the Iranians will feel to an extent that they have some high ground now, that they were the ones who, within the terms of the agreement, they played ball. I think to throw it all away now and go directly for weapons-grade plutonium and to support the program, that would cost them that gain, and it would also mean that, pick up on Amos's comment, they end up in a conflict a bit quicker than they really wanted. I mean, the steady growth and deployment of their capability, there is a scheme to this, and they're not yet done. But what we have to do is get into that business of forward containment.
Dr. Samore, I will add two questions to make things more interesting. A, do you see a regime change in Iran as a result of the Trump sanctions? And, okay, that's enough. And the previous question.
So I think Trump's strategy or plan is to break the nuclear agreement, reimpose international economic sanctions against Iran, and force the Iranians to accept a better deal under pressure, including military threats. I don't think that's going to work. At least for now, the Iranians are going to try to isolate the United States for violating the agreement, which we've done, and try to offer to continue to observe the nuclear constraints as long as the other parties to the agreement, the Europeans, Russia, and China, continue to resist U.S. secondary sanctions and allow Iran to benefit from the agreement. I don't know if that strategy is really sustainable in the long run, because sooner or later the U.S. secondary sanctions will begin to erode the economic benefits that Iran receives from the agreement, and there'll be pressure inside Iran to at least resume some of their nuclear activities. But I agree with John, the Iranians will be very, very cautious in how they resume their nuclear program, because they don't want to give Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu a pretext to bomb them. I think the overall Iranian strategy is to try to avoid a confrontation, at least through the U.S. presidential elections in 2020, in hopes that President Trump will not be reelected.
And what about the regime change in Iran?
Look, I wish that we could bring about regime change in Iran. It would be wonderful. I've always been skeptical of our ability to do it. And there's a debate, which I don't know the answer to. Are you more likely to promote regime change by isolating, sanctioning, pressuring Iran, or are you more likely to bring about regime change by opening the system up? And at least in part, the theory behind the nuclear deal was that you can accelerate regime change by greater contacts. And to some extent, I thought that the protests in Iran over the misuse of the extra revenue that the Iranian government obtained through the nuclear deal, I thought that strengthened the argument that the best way to kill the Iranian regime is actually through kindness rather than punishment.
I agree. Ms. Shine, what do you think of the effect of Trump decision on the overall strategic situation in the Middle East and the regime change, the possible regime change in Iran? And I'll tell you what I ask. It seems, to me at least, that the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu is basing to large extent his strategy on regime change in Iran, which means let's go on with the sanctions, with the severe sanctions, and get a regime change in Iran which will solve all the other problems. Or it will make the Iranian break to the bomb, and then we shall bomb them, and then there will be a regime change. This is the strategy that the way I read it. Maybe I'm wrong, tell me if I'm wrong.
I don't know if you are wrong. It's too presumptuous. But I think, first of all, on your first question, the decision yesterday to leave the nuclear agreement, I think for the immediate term, it complicates the situation. As an Israeli, I will tell you, I would prefer for the American administration to continue pressuring Iran and threatening with leaving the agreement and using it in order to get from Iran things that are important for Israel, which is Syria, and of course the missile project. So if I have to look on the decision from that point of view of what is good for Israel, the way I see it, probably the Prime Minister sees it differently because he supported it, I would prefer to continue with pressure and with the threat of leaving the agreement and using it in order to get things that are very immediately concerning Israel. That didn't happen, and I think we are in a new stage. I think in the previous stage, when the Iranians were just concerned from leaving, the U.S. will leave the agreement, they were more constrained. I think as time passes, and especially if, and I do believe that what Gary said, as time passes, the sanctions, the secondary sanctions will bring Iran to a point in time where they will decide that they are not benefiting anymore from the economic aspects of the agreement, and they will go back to the project. Here I want to say in brackets, the Iranians never rushed to the bomb. They were always doing it in a very cautious way because the most important thing was to preserve the regime. And therefore, they didn't give any pretext to the other side, if it's the US, if it's Israel, to bomb them. So I don't think that they will rush to, they will not expel the IAEA. It's not the Iranian way of behavior. Now, as to it is, of course, immediately connected to your second question, and that is regime change. Dealing many years with regime change in Iran and many theories of supporting ethnic minorities, giving opposition outside Iran, and all these theories that have been floating in the last 20 years, I don't believe in a regime change from the outside. And it is a very important definition because I think the Iranian regime has a lot of problems, and in the future, I don't know if it will take 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, but this regime is not able to sustain because of the gap between the population and the regime. And there are a lot of signs of disappointment of the population from the regime. So I think this regime is doomed in the future. I don't know if it will be a revolution or it be a gradual change or something like that, but I don't think it will stay with us for the next 40 years as it is now celebrating 40 years. But I don't believe in any kind of pressure from the outside that will bring a regime change. I think this is something that is illusion. It didn't work until today, and I'm afraid that it will only unite people because at the end of the day, the Iranians are very proud people. They are very proud with their history, culture, and nationality, and I don't think they would like to see anyone trying to manipulate the situation and to bring a regime change. And at the end of the day, if somebody succeeded from the outside, we can see a military coup, and the IRGC will take power, and not the more moderate.
Sima, there is much talk about internal division inside Iran between the moderate, that is Rouhani and his supporters, and the Revolutionary Guard, and the conservative Ayatollahs, the Qom people. Is it going to be affected by Trump decision? Short, please.
In a short answer, yes, because it encourages the the radical camp that was saying the leader from the very beginning, even though he supported at the end of the day the agreement, was against the US, and he always was saying, we cannot believe the Americans because what they want is not the nuclear issue, they want a regime change. And after the nuclear, they will demand something else. So it plays into his hands, and it is weakening Rouhani and his camp. I don't think he is a moderate. He's not a moderate, but he is moderate relatively to the leader,
yes,
of course.
to his peers.
Yeah.
Mr. Abrams, the President Trump, seemed to leave a door open for negotiations in the coming 120 or coming 180 days. I think the law makes it possible. Do you think there will be negotiations, and do you think there will be amendments to the agreement or new satellite agreements or whatever?
I think there will be efforts and they will fail because what the United States wants in a new arrangement, covering ballistic missiles, no sunset, and so on, the Iranians will not agree to. I think, your first question was what is the effect of Trump's decision? Ask it backwards. What would have been the effect had Trump yesterday said, you know what, we're staying in the agreement? I think it would have been devastating. I think the impression in Tehran and Moscow and Beijing and Pyongyang would have been he blinked, he backed away, he was afraid, he was pushed back. That would have been catastrophic, I think, for the United States and for all of our allies. Here, at least, we have the possibility of moving forward in a stronger way.
But
so I'm
you
very,
think it won't succeed?
Pardon?
But you said you think it won't
The
succeed.
negotiation won't succeed, but I don't think we're going to get a new JCPOA that contains everything the United States wants. I think that I want to turn to this question of regime change, which I think is very important because, I think John accurately described this remarkable Iranian military machine, and it is remarkable. Shia militias, IRGC, Hezbollah, and so on. But the base of this is very narrow. It's a poor economy. Look at the rial. Look at the fall of the rial. And the base of this is a population, most of which loathes this regime, hates this regime. And every chance they get to show it, they do show it. Now, I think we know from the Soviet case, from the Egyptian case, from the Tunisian case, we don't know anything about regime change, right? We have failed completely to predict regime change anywhere at any time. However, retrospectively, I think we can say that the that the pressure that the Reagan administration brought on the Soviet Union had an impact. And what was the pressure? Economic warfare, ideological warfare, and proxy wars, in that case, Afghanistan. I would use that formula in the case of Iran. The economic pressure we now see recommencing. And I think it'll be significant in a situation where the population does not love this regime, it hates the regime, and wants the regime to stop spending billions of dollars on Syria. That's the slogan the demonstrators use. Spend it here, not in Syria. Ideological warfare. We need to talk much more about the vicious, brutal, despicable, hateful nature of this regime. Everyone knows all about how terrible it is. We need to keep saying it over and over again to Iranians and also around the world. And then the proxy wars. Here's the problem for President Trump. He doesn't want to be involved in these. He wants a kind of immaculate conception policy. He wants out, and it won't work. That won't work. And he will hear that from Israel, and he will hear it from the Saudis, and he will hear it from the Emiratis. And maybe he can be persuaded that we're not talking about World War III, but we need an American engagement on the ground if this policy is going to be successful. And if it is successful, again, we don't know. This regime could fall in a year, and it could fall in 20 years. And I would argue that our pressure, no kindness, zero kindness, I would argue that our pressure the date earlier.
Amos, please address President Trump yesterday spoke at length about the North Korean lessons. He mentioned Pompeo's trip he mentioned Pompeo's trip to North Korea, and he mentioned the success of the North Korean. Do you think he hinted that, you see, the way I've succeeded with my negotiation strategy with North Korea, I'm going to succeed with the Iranians, which means I will scare them to death, and then I'll extract concessions from them. Do you think it is realistic to expect that it will work as President Trump thinks?
First, I am not so sure it will work with North Korea.
Exactly.
I would like to share with you, we don't have so much time, but in 1998, no, don't worry, I do it in seconds.
You are
In
the boss
19
here. So.
In 1998, there was agreement to dismantle, 94, and then they dismantled the military nuclear site in Yongbyon, and then they built it secretly in the desert of Syria. Now, can you imagine even Abu Bakr Baghdadi, that Deir ez-Zor was his capital, standing on the roof of the North Korean nuclear and giving statement, I'm going to blow up the area with nuclear. I mean, I don't trust, I hope, and I'm sure they are doing it, the CIA, NSA, DIA, all the friends in the community will do their best, because I cannot imagine North Korea based on the, one moment, based on the Libya lesson, and based on the speech of Trump, that they need the nuclear in order to survive. What is North Korea? It's one jail with missiles and some parts of country. That's one. Secondly, I must tell you, I'm concerned about the president to change agreement without real reason. In Egypt, the Muslim brothers that hate the guts of Israel took over Egypt. They didn't touch the peace treaty, that they hate each article one by one. This is very dangerous precedent. If there is another president, each president can violate without reason. Again, even the archive that has been brought by Mossad to Israel, that is fabulous operation, it shows clearly the Iranians are respecting the agreement because they want to build their capabilities for the long run. Thirdly, I am concerned that the United States is alone. The alliance between U.S. leading, and I do believe in leadership of U.S., leading Europe, China and Russia cooperating with it, and so on, and so on, and so on, that's great asset. Now they are isolated. The Iranians will use it. And Iranian regime, at least from Israeli point of view, we don't have the DNA to change regimes, and any time we have touched somebody that is called leader, we got the worst. For example, we sent for early retirement Mr. Abbas Musawi, and we got Nasrallah. If I can bring him from the second world to this world, Abbas Musawi, I would do it myself. And we do have other examples. We do have Bashir Jumail, and I may say that the United States has lost it, and I don't think they do have the DNA, they don't have the determination. It needs focusing. And we are left with Iran in Syria, with Iran in Lebanon. The Iranians won't be in a hurry to develop the nuclear, but they they can develop brutal regime that will enhance the grip on the poor Iranian public. The worse the economy will be, they will be more brutal. That's my prediction. I hope I'm wrong. I hope they will collapse tomorrow. I am concluding now under the title of illusion.
According to the Leninist theory, the more brutal they get, the better it is, or the closer is the regime change. But let me ask you a question, and it is for all of you. Short, please, because we have 5 minutes left. 6. What do you recommend as an Israeli strategy vis-a-vis the vis-à-vis Iran in all its aspects, nuclear, Syria, supporting terror, etc., subversion, what do you think will be a coherent Israeli strategy vis-à-vis this threat?
You ask me?
Yes?
Okay, thank you. In 1 minute, sorry. I think we need to focus on Iran. We need to prioritize other areas. We need to find constructive solutions with the Palestinians in order not to be involved in violence that will erupt, I'm sure, sooner or later. We need to build our relationship, fabulous our relationship with the Arab countries, not relying only on security. We need to widen it. In order to widen it, we need to widen the political and the peace efforts and so on, in order to be able to focus and, of course, to build the alliance. First, the intelligence, that is quite easy because we do have fantastic reputation with our colleagues in the West and United States and UK and others, and to be prepared for the D-Day. The urgent goal is to prevent the presence of Iran in Syria, and the strategic one for the long run is to prevent the nuclear for the reasons we have given.
I can't help it. I have to ask you, do you see Israel implementing such a strategy on all its aspects,
As you have
including the
said, we don't have
Palestinian
time.
aspect?
We don't have time, so I cannot answer it.
Amos, you are evading my question, please.
I'm sure that our Prime Minister, that I did have the privilege to present to him the Iranian threat in '96, he is totally devoted to Iran. About the other aspects, it deserves another discussion.
Okay. Mr. Abrams.
Just one very brief comment. I think that one of the most critical tasks for Israel is to persuade and educate, if you will, the United States government.
To persuade the
And educate.
United States government to
About
do
the
what?
threat of Iran. I think there's an understanding of how great a threat Iran is, but there is not yet visible a coherent policy. We see step one with the JCPOA and the return of sanctions. But I think these conversations between Israeli officials and American officials at the top, but also at one level down, two levels down, can be very useful.
Helpful in formulating American
American-
coherent strategy.
Yes.
I understood. Now I understood. Mrs. Shine, please.
2 points. One, everything Israel is planning to do, it should take into account that in the long run, it wants to have good relations with the Iranian people. So every step we do, we should take it into account. One. Second point, I want to adhere to what Amos has said about the being accepted in the region. I think that was an important element in Israel's strategy from the beginning, to be accepted in the region, and we can do it only by coming to an agreement with the Palestinians, even if it's not a final agreement, if it's a partial agreement or something like that. But we will not be accepted, really, in the real meaning of the word accepted in the region, once we don't solve this problem.
Also by talking to Hamas?
At the end of the day, the Palestinians should decide who is their leader, and I think we have
And
been
if they don't decide, if it stays as it is?
I believe that we have also to try and find way to talk to Hamas if there is a ground for a compromise. At the end of the day, we have been talking to Assad and to Sadat and to some others that have killed much more Israelis than the Hamas.
Dr. Seymour?
So I think it's a mistake for Israel to expect the United States to fix the Iran problem for them through pressure, regime change, military force, because I just don't think Trump is prepared to invest the resources necessary to counter Iranian influence in the region. He's making an effort to try to force them to negotiate a better nuclear deal, but I think like Obama, Trump has had it with U.S. military involvement in the Middle East, and he wants to avoid getting ensnared in the mess. So I think Israel has to do things on its own, whether it's peace with. Well, I think that the advantage Israel has is that none of the other big powers in the Middle East want the region to be dominated by Iran. So Turkey, Egypt, Saudi, all these important countries, they share a common interest with Israel in preventing Iran from being the dominant power.
Nobody, Mr. Raine, nobody mentioned the role of the Europeans. So although you are after the Brexit, I would ask you to address the question how the Europeans see it and what do Israel have to do according to the European view.
Yeah, perhaps it is ironic that as the only European Brits, I'm speaking on behalf of Europe. But you know, why not in this context? Because the security objectives that we
Did you
share here.
support the Brexit?
In our country, votes are private. So, you know, these objectives on the security agenda for Europe, the international security agenda, they will remain common, I think, you know, regardless of Brexit. So a couple of things, and just how to deal with the Iranians. I think, first of all, being tough with the Iranians to the point of engaging with them in a hostile and confrontational
Which
way.
means brinkmanship, in other words.
It's not necessarily brinkmanship, because, just to finish the thought, taking on the Iranians where they manifest themselves in this grey zone, in this area of state-level activities which is not governed by conventions, and that includes everything from their remorseless investment in and deployment of cyber activity, their use of proxies, their proliferation of conventional weapon systems for their own purposes, all of that, pushing back man for man on that. That's not brinkmanship just because you can do a very great deal in that area, as we have all discovered, before it translates into anything approaching open conflict. And at the same time, picking up Sima's point, ultimately the one thing, we could change a regime in Iran, but we can't change where it is. So they are always going to be in the Middle East, and there has to be at some point an order which includes the Iranians, and telegraphing to them that it isn't Iran itself that we've got a problem with. It is this particularly aggressive, unacceptable means of statecraft which is posing a persistent threat. And thirdly, I think link hands with those people who share that view. And there is a remarkable alignment between most of the Sunni Arab countries, Sunni majority Arab countries, and a very large number of Shia, and the interests of Israel and the European Union and the United States. And if we can't out of that make a coalition that aggressively contains the Iranians, when are we ever going to do it?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It was highly interesting, and I'm really sorry that we had to stop it artificially. Thank you very much.